Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's all about finding the core mechanics of calm. We often talk about resilience or stress management, but what we're really asking is, how do we achieve system regulation, How does a person shift from that internal chaos, from feeling hypervigilant or maybe totally shut down, back toward a state of being focused, kind of grounded, present?
That really is the critical question, and the sources you pull together, they show the answer is way more complex than just take a deep breath.
We're kind of moving beyond the idea that self-regulation is just about willpower. Conscious effort, we have to understand the nested systems that govern this whole process. They're physiological, cognitive, and yeah, deeply social too. Right, so we're peeling back the layers today. First, we need to look at the body's basic wiring. A lot of it's unconscious, purely designed for survival. Then we dig into the mind's constant search for internal coherence, consistency. And finally, how our relationships, our external world, either help stabilize us or sometimes actively destabilize those internal systems. We really want to demystify that switch, help you understand the specific biological and psychological points, the levers, that move us toward feeling safe and engaged.
Yeah, and we'll be navigating some really foundational ideas. Groundbreaking stuff, frankly. We start with Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, which gives us this profound, almost architectural view of the body-mind connection, a whole new map. Then we'll combine that with insights from trauma research. How do you heal the physical imprint of overwhelming experiences? And alongside that, the core psychological mechanisms, things like cognitive dissonance, that we use to try and hold our internal world together. This isn't just theory, it's like a comprehensive map of human resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this physiological core then, because it seems to dictate so much of what follows. When we talk about finding calm, we absolutely have to start with the autonomic nervous system, that ancient automatic part of us handling survival without us even thinking about it. And like you said, Porges' polyvagal theory just completely changed the game here. It tells us it's not just two states like on or off, stress or relax, but a really detailed three-part hierarchy.
That's exactly right. The crucial insight is that the nervous system isn't some simple tug of war between sympathetic speed up and parasympathetic slow down. That old model is too simple. Porges identified three distinct autonomic circuits, and they're structured hierarchically. Think oldest, most primitive reptilian response, up to the newest, most sophisticated mammalian one. And if the newest system detects danger or maybe just feels overwhelmed, the body automatically drops down to the next oldest circuit for safety. You can almost picture it like a set of nested fire alarms, right? Each one bigger, maybe more catastrophic than the last.
Okay, let's look at that structure then. Starting at the bottom, the oldest, most primitive fire alarm, the immobilization system.
This was associated with the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus,
Yeah.
or the DVC. This is that deep biological shutdown, the playing possum state, feigning death. It's what happens when fight or flight feels impossible or just too dangerous. The DVC dramatically cuts metabolic output. That often leads to feeling faint, maybe dissociated, or just this deep sense of flatness, numbness. It can be effective, in certain immediate life-threatening moments, but when it becomes chronic, it's severely debilitating. Think chronic fatigue, digestive problems, that sort of thing.
But the source material points out this really fascinating biological sort of twist to this system, didn't it? Tied to safety and connection.
Yes. This is where the just profound power of relationships comes in. It's amazing, really. The sources explain that this ancient shutdown mechanism can actually be biologically co-opted, hijacked almost, to shift its function from an immobilization fear system, which feels awful, profoundly distressing, to an immobilization passion or love system. It is described as like a diffuse visceral pleasure, deep analgesia. It requires the introduction of specific mammalian neuropeptides. Oxytocin is a famous one. So this means relational safety, trust. It doesn't just feel good psychologically. It literally transforms an ancient survival circuit, one meant for dissociation, into a state of restorative, safe connection.
Wow, that is genuinely astonishing. So relational security isn't just like nice poetry, it's a biological cheat code that turns the oldest fear mechanism into potentially the source of deepest calm. Okay, so moving up that hierarchy, we hit the classic reaction everyone knows, mobilization.
Right, the second alarm. This is the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, kicking into high gear. The familiar fight-or-flight response. This is fueled by catecholamines, things like adrenaline, noradrenaline. This system is designed to provide that rapid, massive energy output needed for dealing with a challenge, running from danger, fighting off a threat, even just having a huge argument, frankly. It's active, high-energy survival. This system kicks in when the environment feels hostile, but you still feel like you have some agency, some chance to escape or defend yourself.
Okay. And finally, the third and newest system, the one we rely on for all our complex human interactions. The social engagement system.
Yes, and this one is unique to mammals, specifically because it uses myelinated vagal fibers. These originate in a part of the brainstem called the nucleus ambiguus. And these fibers are fast, lightning fast. They don't just regulate the organs deep in your body, they directly control the muscles of your head, neck, and throat. We're talking about the tiny movements of your face, the tone of your voice, even the ability to filter sound so you can actually listen to a human voice in a noisy room. It's the system that lets us signal safety to others and, just as importantly, read their safety cues back.
And physiologically, its most crucial tool for keeping us regulated in those social moments is the vagal brake.
Exactly. Think of the vagal brake less like an on-off switch and more like a really dynamic cruise control for your heart. It's the rapid inhibition and disinhibition, like tapping the brakes on and off of vagal tone that instantly adjusts your heart rate, your cardiac output. We need this mechanism for constant social adaptability. It has to be fast. So, say you're having an intense but safe conversation with a friend. Your heart rate needs to be pretty steady, promoting calm listening. But if a car suddenly honks right outside, you need to instantly disinhibit that vagal tone, release the brake, let your heart rate jump so you can quickly assess the threat, and then, ideally, immediately re-engage the brake to return to the conversation smoothly.
Right. If we didn't have that really precise, rapid regulation, we'd be dumping stress hormones constantly, every time there was just a minor change in focus or engagement.
Precisely. It lets us modulate our internal state without needing a full-blown sympathetic nervous system mobilization every single time. And furthermore, our sources link this mechanism directly to how the brain works. Cardiac vagal tone, the measure of this brake, is explicitly tied to the right hemisphere's regulation of autonomic activity. This connection helps explain why, when people have damage or dysfunction in the right hemisphere, they often show severe problems with the facial, vocal, and even the autonomic expression of emotions. The physical ability to communicate safety and the physical ability to regulate the heart seem neurologically woven together right there.
That really gives context to some of the clinical evidence we see, like that study comparing control participants and those with borderline personality disorder, BPD.
Oh yeah, the BPD study is a perfect illustration of dropping down that hierarchical ladder under stress. It shows it happening. When faced with challenges in the study, the BPD participants showed vagal withdrawal. They took their foot off the brake, essentially. Their heart periods got shorter, meaning their heart rate sped up, and this physical state supported the metabolic demands of fight or flight, the mobilization system. They were physiologically gearing up for escape or confrontation, even in a situation that might not actually require it.
While the control group did the exact opposite thing.
Exactly. The control participants, facing the same challenge, showed an increase in vagal influences. They actively engaged the brake. This resulted in longer heart periods, a slower, more regulated heart rate. And this physiological strategy supports calm, reflective, social engagement behaviors, staying present. So the study powerfully demonstrates it. Two groups facing the same external stressor use entirely different physiologically driven strategies for regulation and survival, and it depends on the integrity and accessibility of their social engagement system.
Okay, that's a staggering overview of the basic wiring. Incredible stuff. But if our bodies are designed, ideally, to navigate those states smoothly, social, mobilization, immobilization, what happens when that natural cycle gets blocked? Interrupted somehow. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this failure to complete the cycle seems to be the core physiological definition of trauma we find in the sources.
That's right. Peter Levine, especially, defines trauma not primarily as a psychological wound, though it has psychological effects, but as a physiological one. At its core, trauma happens when life-threatening events just overwhelm our capacity to respond effectively. They leave our deep animal instincts, as he puts it, gone awry.
Yeah.
Your body gears up to fight or flee, building up this massive reserve of energy, but then you're physically prevented from discharging it. Maybe you're restrained or frozen in terror or trapped.
So the core traumatic reaction is fundamentally physical, not just mental. And healing, therefore, has to start at that level, by somehow completing the instinct that got stopped.
Exactly. The key is finding ways to complete that active escape response that was thwarted. Safely, of course. See, the original energy generated to protect us. That's vital, raw life force. It's meant to feel powerful. When we successfully defend ourselves or escape, that energy feels exhilarating. We feel alive, potent. But when it gets trapped, when it can't discharge naturally, it gets rechanneled, biochemically bound, into what we then label as negative emotions. Paralyzing fear, uncontrollable rage, deep self-hatred, shame.
Right. And the tragic paradox here is that the trauma essentially fuses this vital, life-affirming energy with those overwhelming negative emotions, so the life force itself starts to feel terrifying.
That fusion makes the needed physiological discharge, the trembling, the crying, the sudden heat, the impulse to push away feel utterly intolerable, dangerous even. The person needs to release that pent-up energy, but they perceive that release as this overwhelming wave of negativity that might destroy them or maybe lead to social rejection, humiliation.
Yeah.
So they suppress it, they clamp down, which basically guarantees that the arousal remains chronic, stuck in the system.
And the practical result of that unresolved chronic arousal is often a life that becomes perpetually constricted, limited.
Yeah, chronic arousal means the individual is basically living in a constant state of low-level fight or flight,
Right.
or maybe bouncing between that mobilization and the dorsal shutdown, that numb state. So they learn, often unconsciously, to limit their lives only to situations that aren't potentially activating. They might start avoiding crowds or certain topics of conversation, maybe even intimacy itself, all in an attempt to keep that terrifying internal energy contained. They become, in a way, victims of their own nervous system's attempt to protect them, limiting careers, relationships, potential, just to maintain this false sense of internal stability.
And this chronic physical dysregulation really highlights why traditional, purely top-down cognitive therapy, just talking about it, often fails to reach the core issue, doesn't it? We see
Wow.
this so powerfully illustrated in that case study you mentioned, the patient discussed by Bessel van der Kolk, who instinctively blames herself for everything.
Oh yeah, that's such a crucial insight into the disconnect between our thinking self, our narrative self, and our feeling, somatic self. The patient, driven by her physical, visceral reality, the felt sense in her body, instinctively blames herself for anything bad that happens. It could be her past trauma, or it could be something totally unrelated like a friend's car breaking down. Cognitively, she knows it's not rational. Her thinking mind says, that's absurd, I didn't cause that. But her body feels responsible. It carries the weight of that overwhelming reality it experienced.
And so when a therapist tries to just talk her out of it, convince her to be more reasonable, it totally backfires.
It absolutely does,
Yeah.
because the purely cognitive intervention just confirms her deepest feeling.
Yeah.
That nobody, not even the person supposedly there to help, truly understands her internal emotional reality, the physical reality. She ends up feeling more lonely and isolated. The therapist is engaging her story, her narrative self, but the real emotional truth resides in her gut and her body's trapped protective mechanisms. So unless we find ways to address that physical wisdom, the craft energy that needs to be somehow renegotiated, felt, and released safely, just talking about the trauma often reinforces that painful internal split. The split between what the mind knows and what the body feels.
It really underscores that regulation has to be bottom-up first, or at least in parallel. We have to address the animal brain, the survival brain, before the thinking brain can truly integrate the experience and find peace.
That seems to be the fundamental message, yes.
Okay, so we've established the body holds this unresolved energy from trauma, and it's striving for physical resolution, for discharge. But at the same time, our minds are constantly striving for a different kind of resolution. Internal consistency, coherence. Let's pivot now to the cognitive systems that try to stabilize our internal world, especially when we're faced with conflicting information or beliefs.
Right, and this brings us squarely into the territory of Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. Dissonance is that really uncomfortable psychological feeling you get when you hold two conflicting opinions or values or beliefs, or even when your behavior clashes with your beliefs. And the core human drive here is incredibly powerful and simple. We have to reduce that discomfort. We're wired to do it, sometimes even if it means twisting reality a bit.
And our go-to method for reducing that dissonance is often pretty predictable, right? Leaning heavily on confirmation bias.
Absolutely. The mind instinctively drives us to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, and to actively avoid or dismiss information that might introduce more conflict, more dissonance. This dissonance reduction process dictates a lot. What news we consume, who we talk to, what arguments we find persuasive. It's like the engine of our selective attention.
So what are the factors that make dissonance particularly strong, the kind of discomfort that might actually force us to make a big change, either in our views or our actions?
Well, the sources detail three critical factors that determine just how much psychological discomfort we feel. First is the importance of the decision or the belief. The more important it is to, say, choosing a life partner versus choosing what to have for lunch, the greater the potential dissonance if things don't align. Second is the attractiveness of the alternatives you didn't choose. If you buy an expensive house, the dissonance is high because you have to constantly justify why all the other perfectly nice, maybe cheaper houses you looked at were actually inferior. That's the classic sour grapes effect in reverse, or maybe buyer's remorse justification.
Makes sense. And the third factor deals with how fundamentally conflicting the ideas are.
Exactly. The third is a lack of cognitive overlap. Basically, how hard is it to find common ground or reconcile the conflicting ideas? If your core values fundamentally clash with something you did, the dissonance is enormous. To relieve it, you either have to dramatically change your behavior going forward, or you have to find a way to dramatically reinterpret or downplay your values in that context.
And this powerful need for internal consistency is so strong that our social groups become really instrumental in helping us manage that conflict, right? Even when external reality clearly contradicts our beliefs.
Oh, definitely. That classic study on the group predicting a cataclysmic flood is the perfect example. When the specific date they predicted for the end of the world came and went, and, nothing happened, the members didn't just pack up and go home feeling foolish. Instead, they rationalized the failure. Maybe their faithfulness had saved the world. And then, crucially, they sought to spread their beliefs even more vigorously than before. They needed more believers to validate their now shaky conviction. Social groups are a huge resource for reducing dissonance because they offer instant confirmation and validation. They strengthen our existing views, especially when faced with disconfirming evidence from the outside world.
Wow. That's the mind actively choosing coherence, internal consistency over objective reality, and using the social structure to make it stick. Okay, shifting gears slightly, but still in this cognitive realm. The way we explain setbacks to ourselves seems to fundamentally affect our self-regulation and resilience, our explanatory style.
Yes, this is a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. And the research here is really compelling. It shows that resilience isn't just something you're born with. It's largely a learned skill. It's independent of your past trauma or your current circumstances to a surprising degree. We can actually learn to observe that internal voice, that running commentary, and consciously change a pessimistic explanatory style if it's maladaptive. We can practice interpreting negative events like an optimist would, seeing setbacks as temporary. This too shall pass. Specific, it affects this one area, not my whole life, and often external. It wasn't solely my fault. And the research shows that practicing this skill over time can have effects that are as powerful and sometimes even more long-lasting than medication for mild to moderate depression. It's about retraining the interpretation habit.
And this links directly to Carol Dweck's work on the growth mindset, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The growth mindset, which contrasts with a fixed mindset, emphasizes that abilities, intelligence, talents, they're not fixed traits you either have or don't. They're skills that can be developed through dedication, effort, learning from mistakes. Believing this fundamentally changes how you approach challenges. And adopting this mindset can transform entire environments. Our sources show that in workplaces with a growth mindset culture, employees are reported to be 49% more likely to foster innovation and 65% more likely to support sensible risk-taking. It also fosters patience, both with ourselves and others, especially in learning situations. Because if you see struggle as necessary practice, not proof of inherent lack of ability, you stick with it longer.
Okay, and finally on this cognitive track, Martin Seligman argues we need a fundamental shift in focus in psychology, away from just treating misery towards actively building the skills for genuine flourishing.
Exactly. This is the core idea behind positive psychology. The goal shouldn't just be to get people from -5 back to 0. Symptom-wise. It should be about cultivating the skills that take people from 0 up to +5, +10. Building positive emotion, engagement in activities, finding meaning, achieving things, and fostering better human relationships. These are seen as skills that, once developed, tend to be self-sustaining. They build on each other. And central to building these skills, especially resilience, is self-compassion. As defined by researchers like Kristen Neff, it requires this triad of elements working together. Self-kindness, treating yourself like you'd treat a good friend, recognizing our common humanity, understanding that suffering and imperfection are part of the shared human experience, and mindfulness, being present with your suffering without being swept away by it or judging it harshly.
I think that distinction you made earlier between true self-compassion and just sort of being nice to yourself or making excuses is really crucial here.
It really is. The sources are clear on this. If we try to achieve self-protection or self-soothing without that loving presence, that combination of kindness and common humanity, recognizing our shared flaws, it often curdles into external hostility or aggression. We become defensive, we lash out, we create an us versus them mentality to feel better about ourselves. True self-regulation, true self-compassion means turning that kindness inward first, acknowledging the struggle without judgment. And paradoxically, that often reduces the need for external conflict and blame.
Okay, so our internal regulation systems, both the deep physiological ones and the cognitive ones seeking coherence, they're not operating in isolation. Not at all. Our internal calm, or lack thereof, is deeply, deeply entwined with our relationships and the wider culture around us. Let's look at how our attachment systems kind of dictate our close relationships and how we handle conflict there.
Yeah, understanding attachment styles is really key to understanding how we automatically seek safety and regulation from others when our internal systems feel overwhelmed or threatened. The sources lay out three critical styles, developed in childhood but often persisting into adulthood, that determine our default strategy for managing distress in intimate relationships.
Okay, let's start with the anxious style. What does that look like?
Someone with an anxious attachment style, sometimes called preoccupied, basically operates with a perpetually supersensitive attachment system. It's easily triggered. Even a slight hint of relational threat, maybe a partner seems distant, takes too long to text back, uses a certain tone of voice, can immediately activate this system into high alert. And crucially, they find it very difficult to calm themselves down internally. They often need clear, explicit, and repeated reassurance from the partner to feel safe again. Their internal safety gauge is fundamentally reliant on that external validation and closeness.
Right, and the avoidance style is almost the mirror image, defensively pushing intimacy away.
Exactly. The avoidance style, sometimes called dismissive avoidant, involves suppressing the felt need for intimacy, often because closeness felt unsafe or unreliable in the past. They shut down emotionally to cope. They tend to adopt this defensive posture of hyperindependence, self-reliance, and they often use what are called deactivating strategies to maintain distance. This might look like focusing on a partner's minor flaws, nitpicking, finding excuses to stay busy and avoid quality time, prioritizing work or hobbies over the relationship, or just generally keeping emotional walls up. The subconscious goal is to feel less close, minimizing the perceived risk of being hurt, abandoned, or maybe engulfed by the other person's needs.
And the goal we're aiming for is the secure style, which actually enables effective conflict resolution instead of just reacting.
That's right. Securely attached individuals generally feel more comfortable with intimacy and autonomy. In conflict, they tend to use tactics designed to de-escalate unnecessary tension. They're more likely to interpret a partner's distress or complaint not as a personal attack, but as an expression of an unmet need or pain. They use calming language, express their own needs clearly, and try to tackle the actual problem from a place of partnership, of being on the same team, rather than making it about criticism or blame. And crucially, the sources advise that for effective communication, especially about needs, it's best to figure out what you want to say, maybe even script it out when you are not upset. Then, deliver it from a place of strength and dignity, focusing on "I feel" statements and clear requests. Relying on indirect tactics like trying to make a partner jealous or withdrawing sullenly is generally really ineffective and just ramps up the dysregulation for everyone.
Okay, so that's the micro level of intimate relationships. Moving out to the macro level, the level of societal control and influence, B.F. Skinner points out a pretty stark truth about behavior modification. He says behavior can be changed by changing the conditions it's a function of, and this technology, he reminds us, is ethically neutral.
Yeah, that neutrality is the chilling part, isn't it? Because it implies that the tools of shaping behavior, reinforcement, punishment, environmental design, can be used for any purpose, good or bad. Skinner, however, also notes that the individual psyche isn't just passively molded. People have ways of resisting control they perceive as unjust or exploitative. They might weaken or even try to destroy those imposing the control. Or more subtly, they might start to question the value of the rewards being offered by organized agencies, things like social approval, status, money. They start asking fundamental questions like, why should I seek the admiration or avoid the criticism of these particular people, or the ultimate challenge to group demands? Why should I behave for the good of others if it harms me? This kind of skepticism is actually a psychological defense, a way of preserving autonomy against external manipulation.
But that defense isn't foolproof. The social environment can sometimes be so powerful it overwhelms and dismantles an individual's internal sense of morality entirely. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment is the terrifying case study here.
Absolutely terrifying. Zimbardo's most profound and disturbing finding wasn't just that people behaved badly, but why. He concluded the extreme abusive behavior by the guards wasn't primarily diagnostic of their individual personalities. They were screened as normal, healthy college students initially. Instead, it was diagnostic of the immense power of the situation itself, the bad barrel, as he called it, rather than just bad apples. The environment was set up in a way that seemed to systematically disengage their normal moral restraints, like flipping a switch.
And the specific psychological mechanism used to flip that switch to enable that moral disengagement is something Albert Bandura really detailed, right? Dehumanization.
It's exactly. Bandura's work on social learning theory shows how that situational power often works through specific cognitive mechanisms of moral disengagement. The sources highlight how easily people can use tactics like dehumanization, stripping victims of human qualities, maybe labeling them as animals or vermin, or euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to make harmful actions seem benign, like collateral damage instead of killing civilians. By denying the victim's humanity, the perpetrator, the guard in the experiment, for example, avoids feeling self-condemnation. It allows them to bypass their own internal moral compass. It's a stark demonstration that even seemingly robust internal moral systems are vulnerable. They can be externally overridden, especially when the environment encourages or rewards the denial of the basic human reality of others.
Okay, so we've gone from the body's wiring through trauma, cognitive strategies, social dynamics. Now let's tackle the biggest, maybe most complex system of all, the internal architecture that actually constructs our sense of self, our identity, our feeling of continuity over time. Where does this self even start to separate itself from the world?
Well, Sigmund Freud gave us a foundational model for this, looking at early ego development. He suggested the newborn child initially experiences itself as completely fused with the world. There's no clear me and not me. The critical separation process begins, he argued, when the infant starts to recognize that some sources of stimulation, like its own body parts, its own feelings of hunger or discomfort, are always present and somewhat controllable. Whereas other crucial sources, his famous example was the mother's breast, are sometimes absent. They exist out there, independent of the infant's immediate will, and need to be summoned by an action, like crying. This ongoing process of encountering things it can't control forces the emerging ego to differentiate itself from an external object, promoting the development of reality testing and a basic sense of self versus other.
Okay, so once that basic separation happens, maintaining a stable sense of identity seems to rely heavily on constructing a kind of seamless, continuous internal story.
Yes, Oliver Sacks, really building on the work of the Russian neuropsychologist A.R. Luria, emphasized this beautifully. He said, each of us constructs and lives a singular narrative. Our identity is that narrative. It's a continuous story woven together from our perceptions, our feelings, our thoughts, our memories, our actions. This inner story is what gives us our sense of self-possession, our psychological grounding, our feeling of being me over time.
And the danger, then, the real psychological peril, is when that narrative-making mechanism breaks down.
Exactly. Sacks described patients, for instance, those with severe Korsakoff's psychosis caused by alcoholism, who lose the ability to form new memories and thus maintain that continuous inner narrative. He found they could be driven into what he called narrational frenzy. They are constantly, ceaselessly confabulating, making up stories, generating pseudo-narratives, literally just to fill the void, to replace the self that is continually being forgotten and lost from moment to moment. They are, in a sense, inventing themselves anew every few minutes, desperately trying to stitch together some kind of coherence where the natural, quiet continuity has been destroyed. It really highlights the sheer ongoing labor involved in maintaining a cohesive self.
So if that conscious narrative is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, then the unconscious must be like the vast, mysterious library where all the characters, the themes, the plot devices reside. Carl Jung had a very specific take on the unconscious, didn't he? Not just repressed stuff.
Right. Jung defined the unconscious very differently from Freud, not just as a basement for repressed desires or traumas. He saw it as an autonomous reality, a psychic reality in its own right, and crucially, as an a priori conditioning factor of consciousness itself. He called it the objective psychic. It's objective because its fundamental contents, the archetypes, the shared mythological motifs found across cultures, guarantee a certain similarity of experience and psychic structure in all humans, regardless of our conscious will or personal history. The unconscious provides the deep underlying patterns that shape how we perceive and react to the world.
And is this why fantasies, daydreams, even fleeting weird thoughts are often treated as potentially real things by a psychotherapist working in this tradition?
Precisely. Jung argued that fantasies are the natural, spontaneous expressions of this autonomous unconscious life. They bubble up, and because the unconscious represents the totality of the psyche, including the wisdom of all the body systems and our ancestral inheritance, these fantasies have profound etiological significance. That means they have real-world causative effects, even if they seem irrational. They can lead to devastating psychological consequences, emotional turmoil, even physical symptoms and disturbances of bodily functions. So a therapist can't just dismiss a patient's recurring nightmare or strange fantasy as mere abstraction or just imagination if it's clearly driving their fear, their physical symptoms, or their compulsive behaviors. It has to be treated as a psychic reality that demands attention, understanding, and eventually integration.
Okay, finally, let's try and tie this back to the grand scale of why things go wrong, why we experience dysregulation and suffering. Freud gave us a pretty powerful, maybe bleak summation of suffering itself.
He did. Freud posited that our human suffering basically stems from three unavoidable sources. First, the superior power of nature, floods, earthquakes, disease. Second, the frailty and limitations of our own bodies, aging, illness, death. And third, the inadequacy of the regulations, the social institutions, which adjust the mutual relationships of human beings in the family, the state, and society. And he noted something interesting. We tend to accept the first two sources, nature's power, body's frailty, with a degree of resignation. They seem inevitable. But we are profoundly reluctant, often defensive, about recognizing the social source of suffering, the flaws in our own human-made systems.
Why that reluctance? Why is it harder to blame society or our institutions?
Freud suspected it's because we sense, perhaps unconsciously, that there's an element of unconquerable nature at work within the social problem itself, namely our own deeply conflicted psyche, our own internal drives, aggressions, and unresolved psychological tensions. It almost becomes easier to blame inherent human flaws, or even ourselves individually, than to fully admit that the institutions we designed are fundamentally inadequate or unjust, because that might require a level of collective change that feels impossible due to those very internal conflicts. This inability or unwillingness to reform our own social environment because of our internal psychological baggage is what can lead to widespread psychological misery, as Freud put it. Especially, the sources suggest, when social bonding relies too heavily on simple identification, just being like everyone else, rather than on developing secure, individuated selves who can relate in more complex, less reactive ways.
Wow. Okay. So this deep dive has really shown that true self-regulation isn't just one thing. It's this incredible integration of survival mechanisms and our search for coherence. We've really established two fundamental, necessary paths that you, the listener, need to engage with if you're seeking more calm and stability. First, there's the crucial work with the physiological core. That means understanding your own polyvagal hierarchy, learning how to consciously engage the vagal brake for better emotional regulation in the moment, and for those with trauma, finding safe ways to complete those thwarted animal instincts to finally discharge that trapped survival energy.
Absolutely. And second, there's the parallel necessity of working with the psychological and social systems. That means things like noticing and reducing cognitive dissonance to maintain internal coherence without distorting reality too much. It means embracing a growth mindset to build resilience when you inevitably face failure or setbacks. And it means actively cultivating secure, functional relationships, the kind that provide the safety, the co-regulation, maybe even the oxytocin needed to transform that ancient fear response into safe, restorative calm.
Yeah, it really sounds like it's the physical wisdom of our instincts needing to inform our cognitive processing, our thinking brain. And all of that needs to be supported by the structure and safety offered by our relationships and our environment. Regulation isn't some static state we achieve and then we're done. It's this dynamic balance we have to continually maintain.
That synthesis really is the ultimate goal. And maybe, to leave you with something to chew on, consider that profound thought raised by Oliver Sacks again when he wrote about his patient, Dr. P. Remember, Dr. P was the man suffering from severe visual agnosia who literally mistook his wife for a hat stand. He could describe objects meticulously, their color, shape, dimensions, but he could only truly recognize them by interacting with them, by trying to use them in action. His purely visual world, Sacks observes, had become a world of lifeless abstractions. He couldn't grasp the scene as a whole, the meaning, what Sacks called the physiognomy, the felt, holistic character of the thing.
So here's our provocative thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive. If our consciousness, our thinking mind, our constant inner narrative becomes too detached, too divorced from the somatic, the emotional, the felt sense of the body, if we lose touch with that visceral reality, are we too in danger of living in a world of mere cognitive abstractions? Are we perhaps unable to grasp the true meaning, the physiognomy of the world and the people around us, simply because we're not fully feeling our way through it?
The physical body isn't just a vehicle carrying the brain around. It's arguably the very source of meaning itself, the ongoing integration of feeling, action, and story that seems to be the foundational labor of self-possession, of being whole. And maybe that is the true work of regulation, making the abstract concrete again through the grounded wisdom of the living, breathing, feeling self.